there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you I'd give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
Okay, good evening, everybody. Time to get back to occult readings. The Occult A History by Colin Wilson. We're finishing up the chapter on witchcraft and lycanthropy, the second half of it, so we'll get into that. We've got 20 pages, 21 pages, actually. And unless somebody's got something to say, I'm just going to jump in. There's a story by the Japanese writer Akutagawa that states clearly the point I've been making throughout this book. It is called The Dragon. A priest wants to take revenge on a certain monastery. The monks are always having fun, making fun of his red nose. So by a pond near the monastery, he sets up a board with the sign, quote, "On March the 3rd, a dragon shall ascend from this pond," end quote. It has the expected effect. The news spreads, and on the 3rd of March, there are vast crowds waiting at the side of the pond. The monks are deeply embarrassed. They are aware that when the dragon fails to materialize, they will somehow get the blame. As the day drags on, the crowds stretch for miles around, and the priest begins to regret his joke. Gradually, he becomes affected by the atmosphere of intense expectancy and finds himself staring eagerly at the calm surface of the pond. Then, quite suddenly, clouds appear in the sky. There is a tremendous storm, and in the midst of the thunder and lightning, the smoky shape of a dragon flashes out of the pond and ascends to the sky. Everyone sees it. Later, when the priest confesses that it was he who set up the notice board, no one believes him. The most important statement in this story concerns the eager, tense expectancy of the crowd, which affects even the priest who painted the notice board. He knows there is no dragon, yet the telepathic pressure of thousands of believers finally compels his own instincts into tune with it. There is no self-division, and the psychic pressure is like the rhythmic tramp of feet that crack the walls of Jericho. First, the clouds form out of the clear sky, then the storm, the visible symbol of the release of tension. Something is about to happen. To call the dragon a mass hallucination would be to miss the whole point. It is a mass projection, a spontaneous manifestation of the forces of the subconscious, like all magic. The power of mass telepathy to make things happen is known to most primitive people. The late Negley Farson told me on several occasions how he had seen a Liberian witch doctor conjure rain out of a clear sky. My neighbor, Martin Delaney, whose own curious powers of divination I have described in the appendix to my Rasputin, described an equally strange occurrence. The local Nigerian witch doctor assured his company that torrential rain, which had lasted for weeks, would stop for 2 hours during a party given for the staff. The rain stopped immediately before the party was due to start, and started again immediately after the party ended. In the same appendix, I have recounted at length the curious story of the bandsaw that belonged to the same company. A hen had flown into the bandsaw, and the Negro workers declared that this was because the god of iron had to be propitiated. Mr. Delaney refused to have this ceremony performed because it involved decapitating a puppy dog. 2 days later, another hen flew into the bandsaw. Not long after, it was necessary to make some slight adjustment to the saw. Although the electricity was switched off at the mains, the saw began revolving and cut the manager's hand badly. Engineers spent hours checking the saw and the mains, and agreed that it was completely impossible that it could have switched itself on. Finally, the saw blade peeled one day as it was cutting a log, and a twisted ball of metal struck the operator, killing him. Mr. Delaney finally agreed to the sacrifice of the puppy, after which the accidents ceased. If we dismiss the idea of coincidence, there seems to be 2 possible explanations. Either the witch doctor himself was able to cause the accidents by some form of psychokinesis, the evil eye, or the fear exerted by the mass of workers caused them. Mr. Delaney ruled out the witch doctor, who was apparently a kindly old gentleman. The second hypothesis certainly fits in better with what we have been saying. Most people have experienced something of the sort on a smaller scale. A tense, nervous feeling that something is going to go wrong, followed by a minor catastrophe. Probably the best way to come to an understanding of the witches of Europe is to study eyewitness accounts of modern African witchcraft. Harry B. Wright's Witness to Witchcraft offers some curious examples. He describes the thunder dance in Abomey, West Africa, as an example of the, quote, the strange rapport that seems to exist between the primitive practices of these people and the forces of nature itself, end quote. A tall native danced with intricate contortions, swishing a long dancing stick in the air. Quote, the day had been bright and clear when the dance started, but suddenly I looked up and the heavens were overcast, end quote. The prince, however, told Wright, quote, it will not rain because we will not permit the rain without the rain dance, end quote. And it didn't. Again, it is notable that Wright felt himself participating in the frenzy caused by the dance. When the dance came to an end, the sky cleared again. Wright also describes a leopard dance that is perhaps less difficult to explain. A tall, beautiful native girl danced by the light of fires, and Wright's African companion asserted that he could see leopards. Wright could only see shadows around her. The natives appeared to be following the invisible leopards with their eyes, and when at the height of the ceremony 3 full-grown leopards stalked out of the jungle, across the clearing and went into the jungle on the other side. One of them had a chicken in his mouth. Quote, if I had been put under a trance through some process of mass hypnosis, it was a good one because I felt otherwise quite sane and normal, end quote. But there is no need to think in terms of hypnosis. Animals are telepathic. Under the circumstances, nothing is more likely than that a family of real leopards should look in to see whether the mental leopards were really invading their territory, or whether it was just the natives playing games again. The chief explained to Wright that they summoned the thunder for their own amusement, quote unquote. This suggests at least a partial explanation for two myths that have persisted since the earliest times, the vampire and the werewolf. Montague Summers unearthed so many of them that he was able to devote 2 large volumes to the vampire alone. In the post-Freudian period, the sexual basis of vampirism and lycanthropy has been recognized. Male sexual desire is generally far stronger than the woman's desire. Nymphomaniacs are rare among women, but almost every healthy male is, in imagination at least, a satyr. The miniskirt is a tacit recognition of this, that a quite impersonal appetite is aroused in the male by glimpses of a woman's sexual regions. It is difficult to imagine a society in which the men wear short tunics and try to give girls glimpses of their sexual members. Not many women would want to see them. It would be a sexual depressant rather than a stimulant. Woman, on the other hand, realizes that a man may be caught more easily by a glimpse up her dress than by a more subtle parade of her charms. I was amused by an account of a journalist friend of how he became interested in his wife. They were both in amateur theatricals, and she was climbing the ladder when her tights split, revealing transparent panties. Quote, I decided there was more to her than met the eye, end quote, said my friend. They have now been happily married for many years. This violent, impersonal sexual appetite of the male becomes dangerous if subjected to frustration and may develop an element of cruelty. Robert Musil's portrait of the sex murderer Moosbrugger in The Man Without Qualities emphasizes the frustration of the journeyman carpenter who, quote-unquote, sleeps rough and wanders from village to village, never having the opportunity to satisfy the appetite. Quote, something that one craves for just as naturally as one craves for bread or water is only there to be looked at. After a time, one's desire for it becomes unnatural. It walks past, the skirt swaying around its ankles. It climbs over a stile, becoming visible right up to the knees, end quote. I have pointed out in my Case of Murder, 1969, how often vagrants like Moosbrugger become sexual killers. The fierceness of the desire may turn to resentment against women. The Birmingham YWCA murderer, Patrick Byrne, said that he killed, quote, to, quote, get my own back on women for causing tension through sex, end quote. The German murderer Pomeranke committed his first sex murder in a park after seeing a film called The Ten Commandments and convincing himself that women were all evil. In that case, why rape them as well as killing them? At the time of writing, 1970, John Collins is on trial in Ann Arbor accused of the murder of Karen Beineman. She was not only raped and strangled, but tortured with some pointed object and with acid. Psychologists argue that all men have a quote-unquote social personality, an obligation to behave in a balanced and friendly manner, and that this may cover a depth of murderous frustration. This applies particularly in young men. Most sex crimes are committed by men under 25, often under 20. Walking down a street crowded with girls on their way to the office, they feel like starving men surrounded by food that does not belong to them. In a woman like Isabel Gowdy, this kind of split personality leads to witchcraft. In a man, it may lead to a form of lycanthropy in which his beast, quote-unquote, personality takes over and commits rape. This is the view put forward by the Jungian psychologist Robert Eisler in his classic study, Man into Wolf, 1949. He advances the interesting view that man was once a peaceful herbivorous ape living on roots and berries, but man is also an imitative creature, and in his battle against wild animals, a life and death struggle, he began to deliberately acquire the ferocity and bloodlust of the wild animal. A modern manifestation of this is the sneaking, fear-tinged admiration that many people have for criminals, particularly violent ones. They feel that violent people need taking account of, quote unquote, and that the most effective way of taking account is to generate a certain sympathy. This view would certainly explain the leopard dance witnessed by Harry Wright and the cults of leopards and other wild animals in Africa. William Seabrook tells the story of a quiet little native clerk who donned a panther skin with iron claws and killed a girl. The clerk was totally convinced that he became a panther periodically, and he told Seabrook that he much preferred a panther's life to his own. The natives of Africa naturally fear the panther and the leopard, far more than the lion or tiger, which rarely become man-killers, and from the most distant times, the response to this fear on the part of the bolder spirits was an attempt to achieve some kind of empathy with the killers. The response of primitive man to the cave bear no doubt illustrates the same thing. In medieval Europe, wolves were the commonest and most dangerous beasts of prey, and the sexual obsessions that drove Isabel Gaudy caused sexually frustrated peasants to identify with wolves. But the most curious question is how far their obsession caused actual physical changes. William Seabrook has a remarkable description of how a Russian emigre woman meditated on hexagram 49 from the I Ching, whose meaning is associated with an animal's fur and with molting. She imagined herself to be a wolf in the snow, then began to make baying noises and slaver at the mouth. When one of the witnesses attempted to wake her up, she leapt at his throat and tried to bite it. In the case of Giles Garnier, executed as a werewolf in 1574, he seems to have carried out the attacks on children, either in the shape of a man or a wolf. The charge drawn up at Dole alleged that he had seized a 12-year-old girl and killed her in a vineyard with his hands and teeth, then dragged her along the ground with his teeth into the wood at Le Serre, where he ate most of her. He so enjoyed it that he took some home for his wife. This does not indicate that she was also a loup-garou. 300 years later, in the same area, a peasant named Martin Dumoulard made a habit of murdering girls that he lured into lonely places and taking their clothes to his wife. He would say, quote, "I've murdered another girl," end quote, and then go off with a spade. She seems to have regarded these activities as a sign of mild eccentricity. He killed a 12-year-old boy in a wood and was about to eat the flesh, quote unquote, although it was a Friday, when he was interrupted by some men. They testified that he was in human form, and Garnier agreed. But he insisted that he was in the shape of a wolf when he strangled a 10-year-old boy and tore off the leg with his fangs. He does not explain how a wolf could strangle anybody. He also attacked another 10-year-old girl, again wearing his wolf shape, but was forced to flee when interrupted. She died of her wounds. On this occasion, the peasants who interrupted Garnier saw him as a wolf, but nevertheless thought they recognized Garnier's face. He was sentenced to be burned alive. It is by no means unusual for sex killers to eat part of the body of the victim. Albert Fish cooked and ate parts of a 10-year-old girl, Grace Budd, at Greenburg, New York, in 1928. Ed Gein, the Wisconsin murderer, ate parts of the women he killed, and also made waistcoats from their skin. This also brings to mind the fertility rites of the Aztecs described by Ornella Volta in her book on vampirism, in which the priest first sacrificed a virgin, then skinned her and dressed in her skin to perform the ritual dance. So Garnier's strange appetite for human flesh need not be taken as evidence that he really became a wolf. But it is impossible to doubt that he entered a trance-like state in which he felt himself to be a wolf, like Seabrook's Russian émigré. And it is not conceivable, and is it not conceivable, that some physical transformation did take place, a physical expression of the instinctive forces that erupted from his subconscious? In the Lon Chaney film The Wolfman, Chaney becomes a kind of upright beast, closer to an ape than a wolf. The descriptions of the peasants in the case of Garnier make it seem that this is what they also saw. The most celebrated European werewolf trial occurred near Cologne 15 years after Garnier's execution, and is altogether more closely connected with orthodox cases of witchcraft. Peter Stube, or Stumpf, confessed that he had been sexually intimate with a succubus, a demon in female form, for 28 years, and that the demon had given him a magic belt, whereby he could transform himself into a wolf, an enormous, powerful creature. Over the 28 years, Stube committed many murders. The details closely resemble those in the Garnier case. Thank you. Hand-delivered adult beverages. I like it. Over the 28 years, Stube committed many murders. The details closely resemble those in the Garnier case, and also made an attempt on the lives of 2 of his daughters-in-law, which sounds remarkably like sexual jealousy. The sentence passed on Stube was particularly cruel: to have his flesh pulled off with red-hot pincers, and his bones broken with blows of a hatchet, before being decapitated. The fact that Stube was tortured in order to force the confession raises the possibility that the whole thing may have been imagination. The magic belt, which he claimed to have hidden in a valley, was not found. The case caused excitement all over Europe. Montague Summers tells a great many tales of werewolves in his credulous way, but few of them add anything to what we have already said. On the contrary, it becomes quite clear that most of them must be dismissed as inventions and old wives' tales. There is one element common to most of them. Someone attacked by a werewolf manages to cut off its paw, or put out its eye, or wound it in the throat. Later, a man or woman is found without a hand and confesses to being the werewolf. Olaus Magnus, a medieval chronicler, tells the story of a slave who wanted to convince his mistress that werewolves existed, and came out of the cellar in the form of a wolf. Attacked by her dogs, he lost an eye. The next day, the slave was found to have lost his eye. Both Montague Summers and Sir James Fraser, in The Golden Bough, tell the story of a huntsman of Auvergne. I don't know, I'll go with that, who cut off the paw of a wolf that attacked him. Recounting the story to a friend, he discovered that the paw had changed into a woman's hand with a ring on the finger, which the friend recognized as belonging to his wife. The wife, nursing a wrist from which the hand had been amputated, confessed to being a werewolf and was executed. Fraser then goes on to tell stories of Chinese were-tigers, were-cats, and even were-crocodiles, making it clear that each part of the world has its own variation on the theme. Common to many of the stories is the notion that transformation occurs only at the time of the full moon, the white goddess again, and that if the hands or feet of the were-creature are amputated, its power is permanently lost. In some accounts, there seems to be a certain confusion as to whether the were-creature, wolf, cat, hare, is a demon or simply a witch. Werewolves have failed to survive the age of witchcraft, and it is interesting to speculate why this should be so. The answer may be that urban civilization has no room for this kind of abnormality. Oh God, if he was alive now, well, yeah, if he was alive now, he just died. He died back in 2013, I think it was. Um, Civilization has no room for this kind of abnormality. The victims of werewolves were generally children, and men like Garnier and Stube may well have felt the need to escape the torments of conscience by convincing themselves that they were victims of a terrible destiny. The modern child rapist is usually so feeble-minded and demoralized that the need does not arise. This may also explain why tales of vampires have retained their hold on the human imagination. It is a rationalization of a more general and powerful emotion. In every large modern city, the police are familiar with the activities of a sexual pervert called the piqueur. This is a man who takes a sharp pointed instrument, an ice pick or awl, and stabs women in crowds. The woman feels a sudden sharp pain in the thigh or buttock. By the time she has looked around, the man is gone. In most cases, the wound is painful but not dangerous. Occasionally, when the piqueur, I'll say piqueur, has an obsession with breasts, the instrument may penetrate the heart and cause death. This, to speak of sadistic aggression, quote unquote, as the medical textbooks do, is to leave the phenomena unexplained. All that has happened is that a man or youth with a strong romantic fixation on women lacks the necessary courage or indifference to approach them until the desire becomes a torment. His daydreams of making love to women lack conviction because he feels he would be rejected. But daydreams of sadistic attacks can be altogether more satisfying because he can imagine himself raping a girl. When he drives his ice pick into the buttocks of a pretty girl in a crowd, he feels that he is taking revenge on her for rejecting him. This clearly explains the psychology of vampirism. It is a frustrated sexuality turned to aggression. Add to this the fear of the dead and of the supernatural entities, and the story takes on a power that fascinates the human imagination. But this is not to assert that vampirism is merely a superstition or a delusion. Examples of it are so well authenticated that it would be absurd to try to maintain a strictly rationalist position. We are again in the realm of the borderland of the mind, where strange forces can erupt from the subconscious and take an apparently material shape. Montague Summers cites a case from the Proceedings of the National Laboratory for Psychical Research, 1927, in which a young Romanian peasant girl, Eleanor Zugan, showed devil's bites, quote unquote, on her hands and arms. The investigator describes how she was about to take a sip from a cup of tea when she cried out. Marks of teeth appeared on the back of her hand and developed into bruises. A few minutes later, she was bitten on the forearm under her sleeve, and again the teeth marks were deep. Was it a ghost or Eleanor's own subconscious mind? Somehow out of control. The question is futile since we have no idea of what forces could exist. No one has ever descended into the subconscious and traced all its corridors. Why should we assert that it was Eleanor Zugan's subconscious mind? If Jung is right, and there is a collective subconscious, then it might have been somebody else's mind. Readers of Thigpen and Cleckley's Three Faces of Eve will understand this point without difficulty. The book describes how a quiet, well-behaved married woman is completely taken over by another self, a noisy, sexy, empty-headed female who loves a good time. This sounds less baffling than it actually is. We all know cases of people who seem to become completely different when drunk, but as one reads the book, it becomes more and more obvious that the two faces of Eve were really two completely different people. It is literally a case of possession, and in the 15th century would have been treated with exorcism and perhaps torture. Since Eve finally managed to achieve an integrated personality that united her two faces, we can just about accept that Eve White and Eve Black were only two aspects of her personality. But the mind cannot grasp it. We can only accept it intellectually. One suddenly becomes clearly aware of the limitations of the consciousness and correspondingly less ready to advance pat explanations for what happened to Eleanor Zugan. Less celebrated than the Eve case, but in many cases even more baffling, is the story of Sally Beauchamp that disturbed the world of American psychology in the late 1890s. In 1898, a girl named Christine L. Beauchamp approached Dr. Morton Prince of Tufts Medical School. She was suffering from nervous exhaustion. When normal treatment failed, Dr. Prince tried hypnosis, and one day, quite unexpectedly, a new personality emerged under the treatment. A cheerful, brash, noisy girl who explained she was Sally Beauchamp. Sally was insistent that she was not Christine, although she admitted that they had the same body. As in the Eve case, this second personality knew all about the first, while the first, Christine, was ignorant of Sally's existence. Sally was bouncingly healthy and was contemptuous of Christine for being such a weakling. One day, Christine decided to go to Europe for a holiday, but was so exhausted that she went into hospital to regather her strength. Dr. Prince called to find how she was, and was told she was full of energy. He went in to see her and discovered that Sally had taken over. Sally didn't want to lose a holiday in Europe and was determined to sit in Christine's body until they got on the boat. Dr. Prince managed to persuade Sally that this was immoral, and eventually Christine became strong enough to take the holiday. In the beginning, Sally always had her eyes closed because Christine was under hypnosis. Finally, she succeeded in getting them open, and then Christine's life became altogether more complicated. Sally would take over for hours, and Christine would wake up wondering what she had done during her amnesia. At this point, a third personality appeared, as distinct as Sally and Christine, rather schoolmistressy and sharp. Sally called her the idiot. This new personality, who apparently had no name, knew about Sally, and the two loathed one another. Sally learned to read her mind. The three women strove for possession of the body, although it is not entirely accurate to say that Christine strove. She simply got pushed around. Her confusion must have been enormous. One day she decided to get a job in New York. Sally took over and got off the train at New Haven. Sally got a job as a waitress in a dining room. Christine found the job exhausting. The schoolmistress hated it because it was menial. One day the schoolmistress quit the job and took her wages. She pawned Christine's watch and went to Boston. Then Sally took over and rented a room rather than returning to Christine's flat. When Christine came back, she was baffled to find herself in a strange room in Boston instead of in a hotel dining room in New Haven. Dr. Prince discovered that Sally and the schoolmistress seemed to have memories of different parts of Christine's life, and the schoolmistress apparently came into existence for the first time as a result of a shock when a man friend climbed in through her window and tried to kiss Christine. It was all very confusing. Eventually, by hypnosis, the schoolmistress, Prince managed to get her integrated with what? Okay. It was all very confusing. Eventually, by hypnosis, by hypnotizing, that's why, hypnotizing the schoolmistress, Prince managed to get her integrated with Christine. But Sally had to be bullied and persuaded to go away. She yelled, "No, I won't be dead. I have so much right to I have as much right to live as she has," quote unquote. But she was persuaded eventually. The psychologist, William McDougall, decided that Sally was not a part of Christine's hidden self, but a completely separate spirit or psychic entity. One is inclined to agree with him. The closest thing I've seen to a rational phenomenological explanation of this problem occurs, strangely enough, in a work of science fiction called Forbidden Planet by W.J. Stewart, in which a scientific expedition to a distant planet tries to determine why all previous expeditions have been destroyed. The only man who seems to be able to live safely on the planet is an old scientist named Morbius, and he is able to tell them that the other expeditions have been destroyed by a kind of invisible and apparently indestructible monster. Morbius is studying the remains of an earlier civilization on the planet, beings who had apparently achieved the power to amplify their thoughts, their power of intentionality, so that mental images could be projected as an external reality. And at the end of the novel, Morbius realizes what has destroyed the previous expeditions. Without even suspecting it, he has also been amplifying the intentional forces of his subconscious mind, his subconscious desire to be left alone on the planet, and this is the invisible monster that has been destroying the previous expeditions. The book should be read by every student of phenomenological psychology. It may have been intended as fiction, but it probably comes closer to the truth about the human psyche than Freud or Jung. Now, if this hypothesis is correct, it may explain not only the mystery of vampires, werewolves, and poltergeists, which we shall consider in the next chapter, but all so-called occult phenomena. The subconscious mind is not simply a kind of deep-seated repository of sunken memories and atavistic desires, but of forces that can, under certain circumstances, manifest themselves in the physical world with a force that goes beyond anything the conscious mind could command. We are all familiar with certain moments when our conscious personality seems to become more real, more solid and authoritative, and we experience a peculiar sensation of power. Imagine this kind of strength and authority carried through to the far greater forces of the subconscious, and we begin to get a shadowy outline of a theory of the occult that avoids both extremes of skepticism and credulity. It is because of the lack of such a general theory that most books on vampirism have been so unsatisfactory. Summers mixes stories of the wildest improbability with accounts that have a ring of authenticity. Ornella Volta, one of the most recent historians of the vampires, adopts a medical and anthropological approach, but she fails to establish the connection between sexual crimes like Jack the Ripper and Sergeant Bertrand and the Dracula myths. She appears to be arguing that strange epidemics of vampirism, such as the one that occurred in Central Europe between 1730 and 1735, are outbreaks of sex crime or necrophilia, when in fact this explanation fails to apply to 99% of the cases cited by Summers, in which the vampires are dead bodies, animated either by demons or by the spirits of their former tenants. A typical vampire story recounted in Augustine Calmet's History of Apparitions, 1746, and repeated in every book on vampires since, is as follows. In the 1720s, the Austrian Empire was enjoying a period of peace. After years of sporadic war against the Turks, and there was a deliberate build-up of troops in the southwest. A young soldier, whose name is given by one authority as Joachim Hubner, was billeted in the village of Haidam on the Austro-Hungarian frontier. One evening at supper, as he sat drinking wine with his host and the 15-year-old son of the house, the door opened and an old man came in. He sat down at the table and everyone looked terrified. The old man leaned forward, touched the farmer on the shoulder, then went out. The next morning the farmer was found dead in his bed. The boy told Hubner that the old man was his grandfather who had been dead 10 years. Hubner naturally told the story to other soldiers in the regiment. Eventually it came to the ears of the colonel, who decided to have it investigated, since it was spreading alarm among the men. The Count de Cadreras, commander of the Alexandretti infantry, was instructed to take sworn depositions in the village. Cadreus set up his headquarters in the church and took sworn depositions from every member of the dead farmer's household. The evidence was so convincing that Cadreus ordered the grave of the old man to be dug up. The body was found to be completely fresh, as if it had only just been buried. On the orders of Cadreus, the head was severed from the trunk. The commission had been told of other similar cases, of one man who had returned 3 times during the past 30 years, and who had tried to suck the blood of members of his own family. The graves of all these other vampires were opened. All were found to be as fresh as the first one. The villagers asserted that one vampire was so dangerous that they were not contented until the count had the body burned. The Emperor, Charles VI, heard about these events and sent a second commission to investigate. They verified the story of the original commission. In 1730, Cadreus dictated the story to an official at the University of Freiburg, and Calmet must have seen this deposition during the next 5 years, since he states that the events took place about 15 years ago, quote unquote. Montague Summers claims that the manuscript is still extant. Whatever. The story sounds circumstantial enough, although this is, of course, no guarantee of its truth. I cannot find a village called Haydom on the map or in encyclopedias, but this proves nothing, since villages change their names if the frontier moves. Whether true or not, and Summers cites it as one of the best documented of all vampire cases, it has all the typical features of the vampire story. The walking dead, who can only be destroyed by burning or decapitation, or sometimes by a stake driven through the heart. The attacks on living people that are said to result in the victim also becoming a vampire after his death. Ornella Volta points out that the body of Saint Teresa of Avila remained undecayed in the tomb for a considerable time after her death. Miss Volta mentions 178 years, but J.M. Cohen, in his introduction to her autobiography, contents himself with the remark, quote, "These mysterious levitations she floated in the air during prayers were matched after her death by the mysterious incorruptibility of her body." End quote. Mr. Cohen suggests that this phenomena of incorruptibility, which seems to occur after the death of so many saints, quote, "can only be accounted for by some actual change in the physical structure that takes place at the same time as spiritual transformation." End quote. The same may be true of vampires. The vampire epidemic of 1730 to 1735 seems to have started at the village of Medwenia near Belgrade, through a young soldier named Arnold Pale, who returned from active service in Greece in 1727. He told the girl to whom he was betrothed that he had been attacked at night by a vampire in Greece, another country famous for vampire legends, but had located its grave and destroyed it, which should have removed the curse. However, he died and then was seen around the village after dark. 10 weeks later, after several people claimed to have seen him or dreamed about him and felt strangely weak the morning after, his body was disinterred by 2 army surgeons and the sexton and his assistants. The body still had blood on its mouth. It was covered with garlic, which is supposed to be a protection against vampires, and a stake had been driven through the heart. 6 years later, says Summers, there was an epidemic of vampirism in Medwenia, and this time several distinguished doctors investigated. The medical report was signed on January 7, 1732 by Johannes Flickinger, Isaac Seidel, Johann Baumgartner, and the lieutenant colonel and sub-lieutenant from Belgrade. They testified to examining 14 corpses, all listed and described, including a girl of 10. Only 2 of the 14, mother and baby, were found in a normal state of decomposition, all the others being unmistakably in the vampire condition, quote unquote. It is not recorded what was done, but presumably the corpses were burned or impaled. Henry Moore, in the 17th century Antidote Against Atheism, tells a story of a man with the delightful name of Johannes Kuntius of Pentach in Silesia, whose corpse was scratched by a black cat as it lay in the deathbed. Subsequently, he began to reappear and drink blood. When the body was disinterred, it was found to be, quote-unquote, in the vampire condition, and apparently resisted furiously when it was cut up. Augustus Hare, the diarist, I don't know what a diarist is, somebody who writes diaries, I guess, recounts a vampire story in The Story of My Life. It was told to him by a Captain Fisher and may be taken as typical of the vampire tales of the 19th century. The house called Croglan Grange in Cumberland was let to a brother and 2 sisters. It stood alone on a hillside. The house was only 1 story high, which is perhaps why the Fisher family decided to let it and find a larger place. The winter passed peacefully for the tenants, whose name is given in one account as Cranswell. One night in June, the moon was so bright that the sister decided to open the outer shutters, although she kept the window itself closed. Sitting in bed looking across the lawn, she was puzzled to see 2 yellow lights moving among the trees. Soon she realized they belonged to a man, who proceeded across the lawn toward her window. She rushed for the door, which was close to the window, and saw, quote, a hideous brown face with flaming eyes, end quote, looking at her. At the same moment, she saw that the creature was unpicking the lead of the window frame. She was so terrified that she stood there as it reached in through the window, opened the latch, and climbed over the sill. The creature seized her by the hair and bit at her throat. At this moment she found her voice and screamed, and her brothers rushed into the room, having broken open the locked door. One brother saw the intruder fleeing over the lawn, but it seemed to disappear in the region of the nearby churchyard. They took her to Switzerland, and eventually all 3 returned to Croglan Grange, apparently convinced that the creature had been an escaped lunatic. The winter passed quietly, with no other alarms, and then, in the following March, she was awakened one night by the sound of scratching on the window, and saw the brown face looking in. This time she screamed immediately. Her brothers, instead of rushing into her room, went out the front door and fired at the figure as it made away across the lawn. It stumbled, then ran on. They both pursued it to the churchyard and saw it enter a tomb. The following day the brothers went to the tomb, accompanied by the servants from Croglan Grange. The coffins were scattered wildly, and the bones were lying all over the floor. The only undisturbed coffin was the one that contained the vampire who had the pistol wound on his leg. They burnt the body. I thought it said it was 2 sisters and a brother, but I guess it was 2 brothers and a sister. Maybe I just misread that. Anyway, the story sounds unlikely enough. Even Hare does not state that he believes it, but it could well have been based on fact. The same scattering of the coffins occurred in a case that is much better authenticated, the quote-unquote unquiet tomb of the Elliot family on the island of Barbados. The vault, which stands above Oystons Bay, above the cemetery of Christchurch, is hewn partly out of solid rock. In 1807, the body of a Mrs. Thomasina Goddard was interred there. A year later, a child, Mary Chase, was interred, and in 1812, two more members of the Chase family. It was on the occasion of this fourth interment that the child's coffin was found standing on end, and the one containing Mrs. Goddard had been thrown across the vault. The third coffin of Dorcas Chase was undisturbed. On the next opening of the tomb in 1816, it was Mrs. Goddard's coffin that was undisturbed. The others were scattered around. After the same thing had happened a third time, Lord Combermere, the governor of the island, conducted an investigation and found the coffins scattered. This was on July 17, 1819. The floor was covered with fine sand, and the marble slab that served as a door cemented into place. On April 18th of the following year, the governor, accompanied by his military secretary, Major the Honorable J. Finch, the local rector, the Reverend Thomas Utterson, the Honorable Nathan Lucas, and two more whites, opened the tomb with the aid of a party of Negroes. With immense difficulty the slab was moved. This time there could be no doubt that a human intruder was not responsible for the chaos inside. Only Mrs. Goddard's disintegrating coffin was undisturbed. Three witnesses, Combermere, Anderson, and Lucas, wrote accounts testifying to what had been discovered, and these can be found quoted in many books. Schomburg's History of Barbados, Combermere's Memoirs, Sir J. E. Alexander's Transatlantic Sketches, and half a dozen other books. An account by Andrew Lang appeared in the Folklore Journal in 1907. The mystery is still unsolved. Neither does it clarify it to know that 3 of the 6 coffins in the vault were those of people who met violent deaths. 2 were suicides, and the third was murdered by his slaves. The unquiet spirit that disturbed the Elliot tomb was not a vampire, but its activities could have given rise to legends of a vampire, so it is conceivable that an apparently preposterous story like that of the Croglan Grange vampire could be based upon fact. Summers points out that ghosts who have been known to make their presence felt physically points out that ghosts have been known to make their presence felt physically. The old Darlington and Stockton station was as famous for ghosts in its day as Borley Rectory later became. Let's see, I think I've got 7 pages to go. One night, the night watchman, James Durham, was struck by a man who had walked into the porter's cellar. When he struck back, his hand passed through the stranger. But the stranger's black retriever dog seemed real enough when it sank its teeth into Durham's calf. The man called off the dog with a lick of his tongue, and they vanished into the coal cellar, from which there was no exit. Naturally, they were not there when Durham looked a moment later. The ghost seems to have been a man who committed suicide on the premises. W.T. Stead printed Durham's attested account in his Real Ghost Stories. It must be admitted that Summers offers no convincing evidence of the kind that would satisfy the Society for Psychical Research throughout his 2 large volumes, and this is undoubtedly because his curiosity about such things was avid but superficial. He had no insight into what lay behind them. The case is quite different with Dion Fortune, one of the greatest of modern occultists, whose book Psychic Self-Defense, 1930, is a classic of its kind. She connects vampirism directly with negative psychic forces, the evil eye. In this connection, I have already mentioned her account of the school principal who launched a psychic attack on her. As reported in the first chapter of her book, the attack hardly sounds psychic. Dion Fortune went to announce that she was leaving the school, ignoring the warning of a colleague who told her that if she confronted the principal, she would never leave. The woman's method of attack was to assert that Miss Firth, Dion Fortune's real name, was incompetent and had no self-confidence. She repeated this assertion over and over again for 4 hours. Quote, I entered the room a strong and healthy girl. I left it a mental and psychic I left it a mental and physical wreck and was ill for 3 years. End quote. She remained drained of vitality for a long time. Whether or not the principal really employed psychic methods, I am inclined to doubt it. Her attack had the result of turning Miss Firth's interests to the field of psychology, then of occultism. Dion Fortune's short chapter on vampirism is probably the most sensible account that exists of the subject. She begins by remarking on cases that she encountered as a psychiatrist. When one marital partner seemed to drain the other of energy, or when a parent seems to feed on the energy of a child. She claims that most Oedipus complexes are of this nature. Knowing what we do of telepathy and the magnetic aura, it appears to me not unreasonable to suppose that in some way we do not as yet fully understand the negative partner of such a rapport is shorting onto the positive partner. There's a leakage of vitality going on, and the dominant partner is more or less consciously lapping it up, if not actually sucking it out. End quote. She goes on to quote Commander Baring Gould, the author of Oddities, who claims that certain of the Berberlangs of the Philippines practice vampirism by liberating the astral body from the physical body and performing their vampirism, a draining of vitality, not of blood, as ghosts, so to speak. She then describes a case of which she had personal knowledge. The French windows of a certain house would blow open in the course of the evening, and locking them seemed to have no effect. A young homosexual who lived in the house was under psychiatric treatment, but seemed continually drained of vitality. One evening, an adept in occultism was present when the local dogs began to bark and the windows opened. He told them that something had come in. When they turned off the lights, they were able to see a dull glow in a corner of the room. When they put their hands into the glow, they felt a tingling sensation such as is experienced when the hands are put into electrically charged water. End quote. The occultist dispatched the spirit by absorbing it through sympathy, of which more will be said in a moment. The young homosexual then admitted that he thought he knew the source of the trouble. It was a cousin, also homosexual, who had been caught on the battlefields of France practicing necrophilia on dead soldiers, and went back to England for psychiatric treatment. The young boy had often been sent to sit with his cousin, and sexual relations developed. On one occasion, he bit the boy on the neck, drawing blood. It was after the two separated that the phenomena began, and the boy had nightmares of being attacked by a ghost, which left him drained of energy. The occultist says Dion Fortune, was of the opinion that the necrophile cousin was not the primary vampire in the case. Her theory is that some of the soldiers on the Western Front were of Eastern European origin, especially Hungarians, and that some of these knew certain traditional tricks of occultism, the most important being how to avoid the second death, quote unquote, the disintegration of the astral body after the death of the physical body. They, quote, maintained themselves in the etheric double by vampirizing the wounded. Now vampirism is contagious. The person who is vampirized, being depleted of vitality, is a psychic vacuum, himself absorbing from anyone who comes across in order to refill his depleted sources of vitality. He soon learns by experience the tricks of a vampire without realizing their significance, and before he knows it, knows where he is a full-blown vampire himself. End quote. However, the occultist did not believe that the vampire was the necrophile cousin. He was of the opinion that the astral body of some deceased Magyar soldier had attached itself to the necrophile and had been transferred to his young cousin after the neck-biting episode. To the skeptic, all this is bound to sound absurd, but it has a ring of its own kind of logic about it, and certainly explains vampirism in the way that Summers fails to do. Dion Fortune's explanation of werewolves also involves the astral body, or etheric double. She explains that powerful minds can create thought forms that actually possess a life of their own and become elementals. She goes on to describe how she once did the same thing, involuntarily herself. She was lying on a bed thinking highly unpleasant and negative thoughts about a friend who had done her an injury. In a semi-dozing state, quote, there came to my mind the thought of casting off all restraint and going berserk. The ancient Nordic myths rose before me, and I thought of Fenris, the wolf horror of the north. Immediately I felt a curious drawing out sensation from my solar plexus, and there materialized beside me on the bed a large wolf. I could distinctly feel its back pressing against me as it lay beside me. I knew nothing of the art of making elementals at that time, but had accidentally stumbled upon the right method. The brooding, highly charged with emotion, the invocation of the appropriate natural force, and the condition between sleeping and waking in which the etheric double readily extrudes. End quote. Although scared stiff, she managed not to panic, and ordered the creature off the bed. It seemed to change into a dog and went out through the corner of the room. That night, someone else in the house reported dreams of wolves and of seeing the eyes of a wild animal shining in the darkness. She decided to seek the advice of the teacher, almost certainly Crowley, who told her that she had to absorb the creature she had made. But since it had been created out of the desire to settle accounts with a particular person, she had to begin by forgetting her longing for revenge, and as if by coincidence, the ideal opportunity for revenge presented itself at that exact time. Quote, I had enough sense to see that I was at the dividing of the ways, and if I were not careful, would take the first step on the left-hand path. She decided to forgive the offender and to reabsorb the wolf, which she describes in a very long quote, well, half a page quote. Quote, it came in through the northern corner of the room again. Subsequently, I learned that the north was considered among the ancients as the evil quarter, and presented itself on the hearthrug in quite a mild and domesticated mood. I obtained an excellent materialization in the half-light, and could have sworn that a big Alsatian was standing there looking at me. It was tangible even to the dog-like odor. From it to me stretched a shadowy line of ectoplasm. One end was attached to my solar plexus, and the other disappeared in the shaggy fur of its belly. I began by an effort of will and imagination to draw the life out of it along this silver cord, as if sucking lemonade up a straw. The wolf form began to fade, the cord thickened and grew more substantial. A violent emotional upheaval started in myself. I felt the most furious impulses to go berserk and rend and tear anything and anybody that came to hand, like the Malay running amok. The wolf form now faded into a shapeless gray mist. This too absorbed along the silver cord. The tension relaxed, and I found myself bathed in perspiration. It is a curious point that during the brief 24 hours of the thing's life, the opportunity for an effectual vengeance presented itself. End quote. Unlike her master, Crowley, Dion Fortune never gives the impression of being an exhibitionist, avid to create effects. The extraordinary material in her books and the sober, factual manner in which it is presented make her almost unique among writers on occultism. Even a skeptic has to admit that she writes as if she knows what she's talking about, and without the overblown romantic language of most occultists. And what she says here about the contemplation of the left-hand path explains a great deal about the lives of the magicians. In the Kabbalah, the world of magic, Yesod, the moon, is on the lower level than the world of intellect and imagination, Hod, or the vital creative forces of nature, Netsha. Certain people possess natural magical faculties, but unless these are subservient to intellect and imagination, they will tend to be used in the service of negative emotion, malice, envy, and so on. The result is character degeneration. Most people possess magical faculties. Most people are fortunately unaware of it. It is interesting to observe that the vampire bat seems to have been named after the legendary vampire rather than vice versa. Until recent years, little was known about the creature. When it was finally studied by zoologists, it was discovered that the bat is not a blood sucker, but that it laps blood as a cat laps milk. Unlike Dracula and his confreres, the vampire bat does not leave two tiny punctures. It slashes an incision in the skin of the victim with its incisors. Then its tongue flickers in and out with great rapidity, drinking the blood as it runs. The cut usually continues to bleed after the bat has finished drinking. The only attribute of the vampire bat that sounds at all supernatural is its ability to make the incision without causing pain or waking a sleeper. Men who have been attacked by vampires in tropical countries wake up to find that they have bled on to the bed sheets. Scientific observers have noted that animals stand quite still while the bat makes the incision, apparently quite unalarmed by the attack. No one has tried to explain why this is so. It will be interesting to observe whether the legends of vampires change their character as the facts about the vampire bat become better known. A story printed in the Daily Express in June 1970 reveals that the vampire legend is still alive. Quote, armed with a wooden stake and a crucifix, Alan Farrow prowled among the tombstones of a graveyard. He was hunting the vampire of Highgate Cemetery, and 24-year-old Farrow told a court yesterday, my intention was to search out the supernatural being and destroy it by plunging the stake in its heart. Farrow pleaded guilty at Clerkenwell, London, to entering St. Michael's churchyard, Highgate Cemetery for unlawful purposes. He was remanded in custody for reports. Last night, Mr. Sean Manchester, leader of the British Occult Society, said, I am convinced that a vampire exists in Highgate Cemetery. Local residents and passers-by have reported seeing a ghost-like figure of massive proportions near the north gate. End quote. Until the year 1953, it was generally assumed that magic in England came to an end with the dissolution of the Order of the Golden Dawn in the mid-30s. A Crowley disciple named Francis Israel Regardie published a full account of the Golden Dawn rites in 4 huge volumes between 1937 and 1940, which, of course, I have, if anybody's ever interested. And the few remaining members of the society decided it was hardly worth going on. But in 1953, a book called Witchcraft Today by Gerald Gardner created an immediate stir. Gardner expounded the well-known Margaret Murray theory that witchcraft is a survival of pagan cults, after which he went on to reveal that witchcraft is as common in England today as it was in the 15th century. Modern witches, says Gardner, worship a horned god and a moon goddess. Readers of Witchcraft Today observed a certain gusto in the accounts of torture and flogging, and may have concluded that Gardner's brand of witchcraft had strong sexual overtones. Oh God, yes, does Gardnerian witchcraft have strong sexual overtones. Francis King, in Ritual Magic in England, says frankly that, quote, Gardner was a sadomasochist with both a taste for flagellation and marked voyeuristic tendencies, end quote. Absolutely. He's the one that brought about the whole idea of skyclad, and he may not have been the very first one, but he certainly popularized it. And he also had certain rights, although there's maybe some influence from Alexandrian Wicca in there too, where the high priest and high priestess have sex in the circle, basically in front of the whole coven, although in some cases the rest of them leave the circle, but still exhibitionist at the very least, if not voyeuristic. Anyway, I digress. Gardner, who died in 1964 at the age of 80, seems to have been a distinctly flamboyant character in the Crowley tradition. That is to say, something of an exhibitionist. The son of a highly eccentric timber merchant who used to remove all his clothes and sit on them whenever it rained, Gardner apparently developed his taste for voyeurism and began being spanked during boyhood travels in the Middle East with a buxom Irish nurse. He lived in the East until 1936, when he returned to England and became a student and practitioner of magic. He joined a witch coven in 1946, according to his own account. As a result of his book Witchcraft Today, a number of Gardner covens sprang up in England. Their purpose, according to Gardner, was to practice white witchcraft, curing the sick, performing ceremonies to assure good crops, etc., but there was a heavy sexual emphasis. In Man, Myth, and Magic, a journalist and photographer named Sergei Kordiev described his own involvement with a witch coven that sounds distinctly Gardner-esque. On arriving in a large Victorian house, he and his wife found themselves in a cloakroom whose pegs seemed to contain complete sets of clothes, including underwear. The ceremony in front of an altar with 6 black candles had strongly melodramatic touches, with oaths signed in blood and the sacrifice of a black cock. The master, quote-unquote, a naked man shining with a red-colored oil, placed his hands on their genitals. On another occasion, a girl was ravished on the altar by the master as a punishment for betraying confidences. Kordiev claims that his luck changed abruptly for the better while he was a member of the coven, and suddenly for the worst when he broke with it. Gerald Gardner's rites also included ritual scourging and sexual intercourse between the high priest and priestess, what I was just saying. He insisted that witchcraft, or Wicca, was a healthy cult and should be regarded as a religion. Whether he is right remains a matter of controversy. Some investigators feel that there may be a certain amount of invention in his 2 books, and Francis King states that he forged a witch's rulebook called Book of the Shadows. In his will, Gardner left a witchcraft museum in Castleton, Isle of Man, to Mrs. Monique Wilson, another well-known contemporary witch, known in witch circles as Lady Olwen. Mrs. Wilson now runs the museum together with her husband, and weekly coven meetings are held in Gardner's old cottage. She asserts that a sex rite known as the sacred marriage is performed only once every 5 years, and insists that English Wicca is basically the worship of the mother goddess, the earth. Francis King states that there has been a recent revival of the interest in the Golden Dawn and its rituals. Rigardi's 4-volume work is now almost unobtainable, and when it can be obtained is likely to cost as much as £80, $192, back in 1971. But a book on the inner teachings of the Golden Dawn has recently been issued in England. The new converts, according to King, are young red brick university graduates, and the leaders of the 2 leading groups both claim to be the reincarnation of Aleister Crowley. An order flourishing in Wolverhampton and the Midlands calls itself the Cubic Stone and seems to be more closely related to Crowley than to Golden Dawn. A long quotation from the Monolith, the Order's magazine, given by King seems to indicate that its magical invocations have been remarkably successful. On various days, the room was permeated by a blue glow, a rose-colored glow, and a golden glow. Voices were heard, presences felt, and blasts of cold air swept through the temple. In King's opinion, the members of the Order of the Cubic Stone are to be regarded as serious and painstaking students of the occult, pursuing the Enochian method. I don't know how you all pronounce it. It could be Enochian. It's Enoch, Enochian. I just pronounce it Enochian because it's smoother. It would probably be safe to say that there are now more witches in England and America than at any time since the Reformation. The best known among English practitioners are Patricia Crowther, who runs covens in Sheffield and Manchester, Eleanor Bone, who runs covens in Tooting and Cumberland, Monique Wilson and Alex Sanders. Sanders, born in 1926, claims the title King of the Witches, and has reintroduced into modern witchcraft some of the flamboyance associated with Crowley and Gardner. He was initiated into a coven by his grandmother at the age of 7 and introduced to Crowley 3 years later. He explained to Frank Smythe, the author of Modern Witchcraft, that he had deliberately used black magic to achieve money and sexual success. Quote, "It worked all right," he explained. Quote unquote, "It worked all right," he explained. But he then made the discovery that it all had to be paid for. Several members of his family died of cancer, and his girlfriend committed suicide. After which he set about purifying himself by magical ceremonies. Since 1967, he has held meetings at a flat in Notting Hill, London, and achieved considerable notoriety via newspapers and television. Like Monique Wilson, he insists that sexual rites are kept to a minimum. But as with the majority of modern covens, most of the rites are performed naked. Skyclad. Madeleine Montalban, who also knew Crowley, describes herself as a magician rather than a witch. She runs a correspondence course in magic from London, teaches levitation. Quote, "Even my young pupils can levitate one another, but it is a perfectly useless exercise," end quote, and bottles demons, which occasionally explode the bottle. For her, magic is a strictly practical and rather cheerful affair. Quote, "Magic should make life easier, but that's what it's all about," end quote, she told a reporter from Man, Myth, and Magic. To summarize, modern witchcraft seems to be far more varied than its earlier counterpart. Some witch covens are undoubtedly an excuse for sexual orgies and have a large element of showmanship. Others are distinctly puritanical and treat witchcraft as a pantheistic religion. Some are conducted in a spirit of research with the aim of finding out how many of the traditional rites actually produce results, either objectively or subjectively. Perhaps these latter deserve to be taken the most seriously. For reasons we do not understand, certain rites do produce results, at least when performed by the right person. This must mean that there are certain laws underlying the phenomena. In earlier centuries, there was no curiosity about these laws, because the devil and his cohorts were supposed to be at the back of them. By the time the age of scientific analysis arrived, witchcraft had vanished. And now, when faith in science has been eroded, magic is seeing a revival. The timing, at least, is excellent. And that is finally the end of that book. Or the end of, not the book, the end of that chapter. So that takes us to Chapter 2 of Part 3, The Realm of Spirits. So we're going to be reading about those poltergeists he mentioned earlier. And let me see how long this one is. Probably going to be a extra long one too. Holy guacamole. Are you kidding me? Jesus. Okay. The next chapter is 73 pages long. So we'll be splitting it into 3 for sure. There's no way I'm making it through even in 2. That'd be damn near 40 pages. Well, over 35 pages. And there's no way my voice will hold out for even 35 pages. So we're going to have to split it into thirds. But it is what it is. We're getting into the last, this is where my marker is. So this is what's left. So we're getting there. We get through this incredibly long chapter. What have we got left? Glimpses. Don't know what that one's going to be about. Oh, Glimpses is the last chapter. So we've only got 2 chapters to go, and Glimpses is going to be a 2-parter as well. So it looks like 5 more readings and we'll be done with this book. I'm enjoying it, but some of these chapters are just too damn long for me to get through in one reading. So, all right, that'll be that for this. I'm going to do some gaming here in a little bit, some Greedfall. So I will see you all then.
Is broken on his feet because I have seen apart. I have known about the body. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take. If you leave it behind, someone will bring. I left you my heart. Why did you do? You left me so was my love? Was it love? You had no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? Follow your heart. Don't take it, leave it behind. Someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You still abused. You left me shy. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? Is broken, one is because I have seen apart. I have known about the body. I didn't anything to say. Follow your heart. Don't take it, leave it behind. Someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You still abused. You left me shy. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? by the blade. I'd eat anything to see the same. Follow your heart, don't take if you leave it behind. Someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You still abused. You left me soft. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? Because I have seen the bar. I have known about the blade. I'd eat anything to see the same. Follow your heart, don't take if you leave it behind. Someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You still abused. You left me soft. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? is broken on his feet because I have seen all apart. I have known somebody. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take if you leave it behind. Someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You still you left me sharp. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? Is broken on his feet because I have seen all apart. I have known somebody. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take if you leave it behind. Someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You left me sharp. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? because I have seen apart. I have known so possibly. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take. If you leave it behind, someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You used to you left me shy. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answer.